Yeah, thanks very much for having me here tonight. It's quite exciting to be here and to see a pretty much, not quite a full room, but pretty full anyway. So I'm here today to talk about energy democracy, a sort of emergent concept that tries to shift the debate by not only focusing on sort of how energy is generated, what sort of resources do we use, but also who it's generated for and who it's generated by. Is this okay, by the way, or is it kind of echoey?
Slight echo.
What if I just put it here? It stops working, but is that better? Perfect. So I'm going to be talking about energy democracy, but this is not a talk about national level policies or sort of powerful financial interests, although some of that does come into it. But instead, I want to take you, or start at least, by taking you on a journey. And I want to take you on a journey to the Scottish Highlands, where in the village of Bregje there was a woman back in 2002, and I'll call her Eileen, who tried to set up a cooperatively owned energy scheme. Now, Eileen's idea was that a small group of local crofters, so basically small-scale farmers, would collectively build a small 30 kilowatt wind turbine, which they'd use to supply energy to some of the local houses directly. This was not necessarily a revolutionary idea in other parts of the world at that time, but it was pretty revolutionary in the UK, or in Scotland at least. It would be one of the first of its kind, and it would serve as a blueprint for other communities in the Scottish Highlands to implement their own renewable energy schemes. However, Eileen's scheme never happened. After a group of other residents in the area decided they wanted a different community wind turbine, a larger one, and so they set up a separate community group, the Eltnish Community Development Group. Now fast forward to 2016, and Ian McLean and Thomas Campbell visit the peninsula of Eltnish, where Bregje is situated. They visit on behalf of the Scottish Land Court, and they're there at the start of an official court case to decide whether this new, larger community scheme can go ahead or not. So how did it get to this point, where two community groups, both wanting to build a renewable energy scheme, and these kinds of community groups are often portrayed to be at the heart of a vision for energy democracy, ended up in a 12-year battle that ended in a court case. So as I said, I want to talk about energy democracy. And by this, I mean I want to focus not only on sort of processes of democracy, but also what bringing energy into that discussion brings to it. And I would argue that by thinking about energy and democracy together, we can try to understand not only how our energy system can be organized differently, but also how we can think differently about democracy, perhaps. But let's take a step back first to sort of try and tease out what I really mean by energy democracy. And this is not so much my interpretation as more the interpretation that activists use. Because energy democracy is very much from sort of originally an activist concept. It emerged primarily in Germany in relation to the energy transition there, but has since been taken up by activists in other countries, including the UK and the US. Now, it's not always clear what it means, and there's quite a few different definitions, but I think there's a few sort of common aspects to it that sort of keep returning in these different definitions of what it is or what it should be. And first of all, it's of course to do with shifting our energy system away from fossil fuels towards a more renewably powered energy system. But it's also about dispersing power, and not only power in the energy sense, but also in terms of its social and political sense. So it's trying to move away from seeing citizens or people only as consumers to seeing them as citizens and active agents in the energy system. And the main assumption is that through this sort of devolution of powers and a more decentralized energy system, we can have more democratic control, which in turn will lead to fairer and more equitable outcomes. So those are sort of the key aspects of it. But what does this actually look like in practice? And I'm going to take you back to Eltnish to explore this. As I'd said, in the village of Bregje, Eileen had explored her idea of developing a 30 kilowatt, 30 meter high wind turbine. Pretty small, very small even by modern standards. It would generate just about enough energy to supply the 5 or 6 houses in the local village. And in late 2002, she took her proposal to the other residents in the village who made up the grazing committee, which is this organization that decides how the local land is used, and they agreed for the project to go ahead. So what would happen is that they would build this 30 kilowatt wind turbine on communally owned agricultural land, and it would supply energy directly to the 5 or 6 houses in the village, who would also still be connected to the national grid for energy backup. So she had the consent from the local population, and the scheme would be managed as a cooperative, where the local residents of the 5 or 6 houses would have a say in how the turbine was built, where it was to be built, and how it was to be managed. And this would enable it, by using this sort of existing structure of the grazings committee, to be replicated in rural villages across the Highlands. By now it's 2004, so a couple of years later, and Aileen's received funding from the Scottish Government's Development Agency to undertake a proper feasibility study to explore what's actually possible. However, later that year, she received a letter from the same development agency saying that it would not give her the funding that they'd previously agreed to, because in the meantime, they had received a letter from another local resident, who I'll call Eric, who had questioned the value of Aileen's proposal. Eric, who was a local community leader in one of the nearby villages, had argued that Aileen's proposal was only of limited benefit. It would only supply energy to 5 or 6 houses, and where would that leave everyone else on the peninsula? They wanted an energy scheme as well, and they also wanted it to be run and managed by the community. So the Scottish Government put Aileen's funding on hold to let Eric explore the option for a larger community-owned wind turbine. And after a number of years, Eric had a proposal. A 1 megawatt wind turbine, about 50 meters high, just behind one of the other local villages on the Aldnish Peninsula. And this project had a different setup than Aileen's proposal, and it was different in 3 key ways. First of all, the turbine was of course much bigger. Rather than a 30 kilowatt turbine, it was a 1 megawatt turbine that he was proposing. This was the result partly of technological developments that had taken place in intervening years. And instead, rather than supplying the energy directly to local houses, the energy would be fed back into the national grid, and the community group would receive an income in return. So this new model with this bigger wind turbine was enabled by the UK government's introduction of the feed-in tariff in 2010. And whereas Aileen's proposal had set out to supply energy directly because a grid connection was just more headache, this idea of generating energy but supplying it to the national grid rather than directly to local houses became the main model of community-owned energy in Scotland in later years. So this way, community energy became a means not so much to generate clean energy for local houses, but rather a way to generate income for rural communities. Thirdly, through generating this income, the project was set to benefit the whole community of Aldnish, all 250 or so residents, and not just a small group of local crofters. And this coincided with a trend in Scottish policy, which moved away from supporting so-called communities of interest to supporting communities of place, where technically everyone who lives in a certain administrative area is seen as part of the community. So whereas Aileen had sought a small-scale development benefiting only a handful of households, which could then be replicated in other places, Eric and the Aldnish Development Group's proposal was more in tune with the technological, financial and political changes that had taken place since Aileen first proposed her turbine. That is not to say there was no opposition to Eric's project. In fact, the opposition, mostly from local residents in Aldnish, was so severe that the project almost didn't go ahead. And this opposition had to do with a number of different factors. And of course, Aileen herself was pretty unhappy because her project had been shelved as a result of this newer, fancier project. And Aileen argued it wasn't just about, herself and that her project was shelved, but more how the Aldnish Development Group had gone about it. She said she hadn't been treated fairly in the process. Instead, they'd gone behind her back to write to the Scottish government to propose their own project instead. But there were also concerns about subsequent engagement within the Eldnish Development Group and how it dealt with the wider population of the Eldnish area. And this is why these members of the court, Ian MacLean and Thomas Campbell, found themselves standing in a field in Eldnish during the summer of 2016, where they would decide whether Eric's proposal would go ahead or not. And indeed, some of the main concerns about Eric's development and the main reason why the Scottish Land Court was there was about how the community group, the Eldnish Development Group, had dealt or interacted with the local population. And in particular, local people, or some of them at least, were unhappy with the way in which participation had been shaped or how they felt they'd been excluded from participating in this project or its development. Because the Eldnish Development Group had held a ballot to decide if the community thought the project should go ahead or not. The local population was somewhat divided, but not too much. About 2/3 of people voted in favour of the project to go ahead. But some of the most vocal objectors were those who would have to live closest to the proposed turbine. So they felt they should have a stronger say in that decision. However, the group's view was pretty straightforward. They said, well, the majority of people voted in favour, so this is what we need to do. It's the will of the people, so to speak. So the opponents, or those opposed to the projects, didn't leave it at that, so they took the case to the Scottish Land Court to try and get them to assess whether this, first of all, was truly a community project, and two, whether it should go ahead or not. And when the court came to visit, they were pretty critical of how the community development group had interacted with the wider community. In particular, when it became apparent that the development group had tried to, you might say, threaten some of the objectors to withdraw their objections, saying that they would otherwise be held accountable or would otherwise be held responsible for the legal costs of the community development group. That didn't actually prove to be true. You can't do that in the Scottish Land Court, but most objectors didn't know that at the time, so they withdrew their objections to the scheme. So when the Land Court came to visit Eldnish, they were pretty critical of how the community group had handled the process. And they said, we would question whether a body which places such an emphasis on the community aspect of its development does itself any favours of being seen to act in such a heavy-handed manner against a dissenting minority within a small community. It seems to us that if indeed the objections of the Grazing Committee were as unmeritorious as contended, then the interests of the development group may have been better served by having them properly ventilated before the court and exposed as such, rather than by seeking to suppress them. So they were pretty scathing in how the process had been handled by the community group. But nonetheless, after some deliberation, they decided that the project, Eric's 1 megawatt wind turbine, could go ahead. And therefore, since 2015 or 2016, Eldnish is now home to its own community wind turbine, while at the same time Eileen's turbine was never realised. So what does this tell us about energy democracy? Now, I think there's 3 key lessons or 3 key messages to take away from this. The first one is that there are clearly competing visions for what energy democracy or community energy is or should be. There's a lot of talk in the sort of energy democracy movement about taking back control, which will sound familiar to people in the room. But what does that actually look like, that taking back control? How is it structured? What kind of mechanisms do we use? How do we organize ourselves as people? And with what purpose? And this example, I think, shows that there's 2 quite distinct versions or visions for what energy democracy might look like. Is it about sort of direct supply to local households, or is it more about sort of deliberation as to whether renewable energy, wind turbines or whatnot, should be built in the local community or not? So these competing visions, I think, are sort of important, as I'll come back to. The second lesson to take away from this is that there's quite some differences between the ideals and the practices of energy democracy. There's questions around who should participate, how decisions are made, and how disputes are resolved, that all have ideal answers, but that in practice are quite difficult to implement. While a lot of community groups that I've spoken to during the course of my research have great ideals, and some are doing great things, including, engaging the wider population, specifically targeting part of the population that might be less represented in decision making normally. There's also a lot of challenges here, and it can quite often turn out to be a small number of local people making the key decisions without that wider engagement. And that can lead to tensions in a community, especially in these small rural places where a lot of my research has taken place. The third message to take away is that despite these ideals of energy democracy and devolving power, these sort of democratic, if you want to call them such, structures and practices are not only shaped from below. They're not only shaped by the communities that engage with them, but they're also shaped by these national and international forces, such as technological innovations and challenges, financial subsidy changes, political changes, etc., which shape who are seen to be part of the public and how they can participate. So, to wrap up, I think energy democracy is a good ideal, and I admit as well I am a member of an energy cooperative, so I'm possibly slightly biased despite my critical take here. But I think it is necessary to at least have these conversations about how energy systems are controlled, who by and who for. But despite this growing push for sort of the devolution of power and this ideal of creating sort of new and the right relation between people and the resources they use, this wide variety of practices and structures that emerge show that it's not always as simple as that. And who decides if these new relations are the right ones or not? So while I think it is important to have these discussions, I think it's important to have them because we shouldn't just sort of accept this idea of devolving power as necessarily a good thing, but we should question in more detail how, why, and by whom the terms of change are defined, and when there are disagreements, how they're resolved. I'll leave it at that. Sorry, I think we're moving right into the next presentation, and then we'll do questions at the end.
Thanks, Ree, and thanks everyone for being here on a Monday evening. Really happy that you took the time. So I titled my talk, Legitimating Power, the Governance of Portuguese Solar Uptake. And the way I've decided to structure the next 20 minutes or so is to take you first smack into the middle of the empirics, into solar energy in Portugal, a country of about 10 million in an isolated part of southwestern Europe. And then to take a step back to a higher level of abstraction, think about this more conceptually in terms of what it means to legitimate power, what it means to have the accountable governance of energy transitions, with solar energy being one such case. And then finally to bring this around to a more analytical, methodological set of reflections about what it means to study these practices, what I call practices of legitimation. And I'll end there with a few words about a book that's just come out on that theme. So let's move over to Portugal. Here you have a country that has the best solar irradiation in Europe. It's been one of the renewable energy leaders in a region of the world that's quite ambitious and progressive in championing goals and ambitions of transitioning to low carbon forms of energy. So you have hydropower that comes up first, and then you have a fair bit of development of wind energy all the way through the 2000s. And about a decade ago, you have what was at the time the largest solar energy park or plant in the world coming up in southern Portugal. It's called Amareleja, just around here. If you look at this map, you see a number of yellow dots, and it's not very important exactly where they are, but you see that they're around the Alentejo and Algarve regions of southern Portugal. And here you have all the bits of other energy producing plants in the country. Up north is where a lot of the wind and the hydro is, and here on the west coast you have the two major urban conglomerations, that's Lisbon and Porto. That's where 2/3 of the population is, a lot of the demand is, both from residential consumers and as well as from industry. So historically this bit of the grid in the south has been quite poorly developed, and here I'm talking about the energy infrastructure, the built environment that transmits the energy that's produced over to where it's consumed. This means that there's a problem for solar energy uptake in that you can put a lot of it in place, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to use it where the solar irradiation is strongest in the south. Right at the tip you have a lot of profitable tourism industry in the Algarve. Certainly from this part of the world you have cheap airlines landing there every few minutes in Faro. Slightly up north you have more peasant lands in the Alentejo region, so there is a fair bit of land availability for solar development. But if you look now on this side, you see a tiny sliver of yellow. This is by month from mid-2017 till the middle of this year, so the last 2 years. And that's about the time, the last 2.5 years, that I've been looking at how solar energy has shaped up in Portugal. And I've spent about 20% of my time there in this period and talked to nearly 100 people in every bit of the energy sector, so most people who matter in terms of determining solar uptake. And this sliver, you might say, doesn't have very much to do with the energy future of a country. After all, it's barely 1 to 2%. Here you might see that it grows a little bit in the last few months, and that's not just because of seasonality. This is the summer, but even compared to summer the year before, it is increasing. And then you think of some of the headlines you might have seen in the last couple of months. For those who follow the energy sector, you'll know Portugal set a new record for the world's lowest solar auction tariffs. It yielded something like €15 or even less for each megawatt hour. That's less than 1/3 the going rate on the wholesale electricity market on the Iberian Peninsula. That's called MIBEL, shared by Portugal and Spain. A couple of weeks ago, we also had 200 megawatts of solar energy bought by Galp Energia, which is a long-standing gas energy company in Portugal, that bought this capacity in Spain for the Portuguese market. Now, 200 megawatts is significant in that all of Portugal installed electricity capacity is 20 gigawatts. So 200 megawatts is 1% of that, and that's going to raise this little yellow stripe a bit. Just as I speak, we have a new government in Portugal from earlier this month, and they've announced that they're going to phase out the only 2 remaining coal thermal power plants in the country as early as 2021 and 2023. So we're seeing a country that's exiting coal, where solar is going to be, based on their roadmap for carbon neutrality, as much as 10 gigawatts of the power mix within the next decade, compared to right now when it's less than a gigawatt, something like 600 to 700 megawatts. So we haven't seen it rise yet, but we're probably going to see a large, rapid scale expansion of solar energy. And now let me take you back a little bit, conceptually and also a couple of years in time, to say why I might not characterize this as really championing a decarbonization strategy where we move towards low carbon energy as aggressively and as much in a linear form as one might like to believe from the story that we see unfolding today. When I went to Portugal 2.5 years ago, some of my informants told me that renewable energy, not just solar, but renewables, had been weaponized, that 10 years ago, when the wind plants were being put in place, there were contracts drawn up by the government with the companies that said, here's a tariff for wind, quite a nice incentivized tariff, you can get good payback on this investment in renewables at a time when renewables were still quite expensive. And so it was promoted, it was incentivized, and the companies didn't have a clause in there that said, and you have to install it by this date. So they sat back and waited about 5 years. Costs fell, but the tariffs were in place, they were secured. And this meant that people saw that these companies were making a killing, and yet the government had signed off on the line. And people don't really like feeling in a country like Portugal, where minimum wage is at €580 a month, and where prices, since they've managed to exit the financial crisis's worst effects by 2015, where real estate prices in the capital have gone up 40% in the last 4 years, people really don't like hearing that the tariffs that they're paying are helping make large profits for private players. So renewables got a bad rap. In 2011, with the national elections, you had a government coming in that had politicized this debate. 2008 onwards, you have an economic crisis and its effects are being felt. And so in 2015, the last time that there was a national election before the one this month, the government that came in was in the opposition, came in and was pro-renewables, but found itself squeezed into a position where it couldn't actually say, okay, we're going to promote these forms of wind and solar power. This is problematic, only if one doesn't think of energy as political, only if one thinks of it as a techno-economic matter. Here I'm going to ask you to join me in thinking in a 2x2 matrix. So imagine that these columns are about one aspect of accountability, which I would argue, building on Bregje's presentation just now, is around deliberative assessment. When we're talking about decarbonization, when we're talking about moving to low carbon sources, we're also talking about changing energy systems, a large part of society, into something that is hopefully going to be more equitable, hopefully not going to increase the drastic inequities and income inequalities that characterize this country and much of the rest of the world. And so we're talking about a context where you might have deliberative assessment that thinks of how are we changing the energy sector, what is the energy transition, and is it contributing to equitable decarbonization or not? If you have deliberative assessment, then you might ask, is there actually something to back this up? Is there something to enforce what we assess to be desirable for equitable decarbonization, which in a sense is a shorthand for sustainability? If you have the ability and the willingness to sanction in line with deliberative assessment, then you have what I'd call, and this is drawing on work with a colleague, Stephen Wolf at Cornell, then you have a condition of strong accountability. And you have this in Portugal in several ways. You have renewable energy targets set by the European Union that member states commit to. These are quite ambitious, and Portugal has kept up with these for 2020 so far, and they've set even more ambitious ones for 2030. There's the new draft energy and climate plans that came out in January this year by each member state. Portugal has adopted really ambitious targets there, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's doing quite a lot to put its money where its mouth is. And then most recently, there's been this procedure for solar auctions that's actually led to, in July, 1.3 gigawatts of new solar capacity being sanctioned at competitive prices. There's another 700 megawatts coming up in January, all within the country. But what about things where there's no ability or willingness to sanction? You do have certain issues. If you scroll back a year, Portugal had a situation where solar developers would tell me, this is not going to work. We've put in our bids. There's this licensing procedure saying, get the environmental impact assessment in place, get the greenfield development in place, and then say that you want to install solar capacity for so many tens of megawatts in this particular part of the country. And then it goes into what I'd describe as a translucent mechanism where there's a special task force set up by the Directorate General, which is the executive agency in the country, known as JEC in Portugal. And they had a number of experts appointed on these committees, but these experts come from the sector where they've had experience with energy. A lot of them come from companies like EDP, Energias de Portugal, which is not a Portuguese company, it's a multinational that's an incumbent, it has a large presence in several parts of the sector, it's vertically integrated. And eventually, not all these solar developers would get the licenses that they were seeking. And some would say, well, what's interesting is that the ones who got the licenses seem to be quite good friends with the government. What's also frustrating is that we've invested in getting the greenfield development done. We have this ready to go. We've talked with investors and they're willing to put their money down for our project. But instead, somebody's got the license and they've sat on it for the last 2 years. That was the deadline to install it. So it's better than the wind case. You have a deadline by when it should have come on grid. But when they hit 2 years, they just get an extension for another year. This means that solar uptake is actually not growing And so in the last couple of years, even though I told you 10 years ago we had the world's largest solar plant coming into place in Portugal, in the last few years we haven't seen that drastic growth. We've seen solar energy capacity stagnate at something that's about between 0.5 and 1 gigawatts of the total energy sector. So one might say that there's hollow accountability. There's a performance of trying to do something, but there's no willingness to sanction. There are also conditions. I won't dwell on this too much because largely in a Western European, more or less democratic setup, we're not talking about things that happen with a complete lack of deliberative assessment. And yet there are some instances, there are limitations when you look at rooftop solar. What you get for streaming back to the grid is a rather small amount. It doesn't really incentivize people with families who go to work, who don't consume electricity at home during the peak output hours of solar production, to put up rooftop solar, even though you have all of these rooftops and certainly land availability in more rural areas and small towns as well. Even though this wouldn't place a large demand on the grid, and even though you would be able to produce power close to where it's being consumed, there are also barriers to community solar and other forms of community energy where you would be able to encourage blocks and districts to consume, let's say, electricity coming off of household rooftops in the retail shop next to it that does need power during the day, or schools. And even as we speak, we see the new government putting in place new legislation. There's a push among member states of the EU to try and bring about conditions where these concepts of community energy are not just defined but put into practice. And so we'll see what that looks like. But so far one would say that there hasn't really been that deliberative assessment. And lastly, if you have a condition where there's no assessment and no willingness to sanction, then we've reached liberalization. And even as recently as about a year ago, we had a conversation on offshore oil prospecting licenses, oil and gas prospecting licenses off the west coast of Portugal. There was a great deal of protest from the public. Eventually this was scrapped. The consortium, at least that consortium, was put to an end. And so I just want to point out that the story now seems to be shaping up in a positive direction. This is really about understanding the contingencies of governance and the fact that how things are settled is not a linear narrative, but really about whether we are putting the right mechanisms in place to ensure accountability. And deliberative assessment, as backed by sanctions, are certainly part of that picture. So just moving on, what I want to say, which is probably the most important part of my talk, and I'm happy to move more into this in the discussion, is how do we study these things? Right now what I've told you is just something you might take my word for or you might question, and yet it comes from a great deal of empirical engagement, and that's backed by some amount of rigor, it's backed by some amount of method. And the way I find this, there's emergent from empirical work, and it's part of the book that I'm going to mention in closing. It's 4 practices of legitimation. So how do you actually legitimate, how do you validate or justify a particular way of moving towards, in this case, equitable decarbonization, moving towards low carbon forms of energy that have beneficial impacts on society at large? And the first of these is discursive. I've mentioned how we've had a case in Portugal where even as recently as 2 years ago, solar couldn't really get off the ground. It was seen as a debt burden on the taxpayer. And then over the past couple of years, we've seen this shift, which led to particular reforms, led to particular mechanisms being put in place, solar auctions with reverse e-auction mechanisms, allowing it to become a competitive form of market-based energy, right? And we've also seen a change in the political discourse around it. We've seen a willingness for people to think of renewables as potentially subsidy-free, but also as something that needs to find place in their energy future, and then ways in which we can discuss how to make that possible. Coming to the bureaucratic bits, these practices of legitimation, and I define them as often codified and sequential, they validate some actions and actors and constrain others. And they're certainly required, but there's ways in which they work, ways in which they don't. What we saw in this case largely in the translucent phase that solar passed through was bureaucratic practices that served to obfuscate the particular mechanisms that needed to be put in place to secure accountable solar energy uptake. And then I draw a distinction with technocratic practices, which define here as performing systematic checks and approval of actions that entail technical expertise. And this distinction with bureaucratic practices is vital here, because technocratic practices are substantive along the same register as the action that they evaluate for approval. So take, just to concretize this, an example like grid availability for where solar uptake happens. And if you have the electric grid present or not in a place, what this government did, that actually ran the auctions prior to the most recent elections, was to say, we're going to first figure out what capacity we have on the grid, and then we're going to put 24 lots up for auction, so that if you offer us the best price within the couple of different ways of framing your bid that we offer you, then you get this license. And that's a transparent mechanism, but it also means that you understand what capacity you have on the grid. It means that they had to do, in fact, a technical assessment of that is intrinsic to the sector that this concerns. And this is not necessarily something where objectivity is possible either. In the north of Portugal, if you take your mind back to the map I showed at the beginning, you have large-scale hydro resources and wind resources that have seasonal flux. So in the summer, these are relatively low, whereas solar is relatively high. You could actually have hybrid systems, and we see more and more of this now with solar and wind, and also with offshore wind becoming increasingly important part of the future electric grid, certainly in the UK. You could imagine putting up solar capacity in the north, and we're seeing examples of this coming up in Portugal, where you use these to stream a relatively consistent amount of power to the grid on the same grid. And that's not something that we necessarily agree upon by just looking at the built environment and the energy infrastructure that's in place today. We are talking about different operating logics. We are talking about the agency of infrastructure, and not only sort of predefined ways of being able to utilize what exists. And certainly with energy flexibility, this is something that our understanding of is changing as energy storage prices become increasingly competitive, which is probably the big story within the next 5 years. We see this changing as well, at least for short-term storage. And finally, the financial means. Some of the people I talk to when I do field work are not even based in Portugal. They're financial investors, they're banks. And when the government took the line that they were not going to subsidized solar a couple of years ago, a lot of developers and financial investors said, this is terrible, it's not going to let this sector get off the ground because it's too early, it's not as mature as other forms like wind, it still needs state support. And what happened then, when it became clear that the only way this would go forward was without subsidies, is that banks sat down with developers, sat down with third parties and said, let's figure out mechanisms. We have power purchase agreements. Can we justify that there'll be revenue flow? When you had the auction mechanism, it was a market mechanism that allowed people to say, okay, there's a guarantee that over the next few years, with prices on the Mibel, on the Iberian wholesale electricity market quite high because France is undertaking renovations of its nuclear energy assets, we have a pretty good likelihood that this will be the cash flow. That will be enough to pay off the capital investment. So that's something that we see the point in being able to finance. Let's develop these instruments. That's really important, because financial flows, even though they're often spatially remote, materially elusive, these practices do enable actors to both block action or to fulfill financial requirements and proceed with material action. So in a sense, financial practices of legitimation are what shape sectoral change. So just to bring things to a close and move into discussion, there's a book, most of you have a flyer out. It's open access. I encourage you to download it and have a read. It's freely available online. I want to say something about my co-authors in this book who've written chapters not on Portugal, but who've applied an accountability lens to different kinds of energy transitions, trying to understand what we can say about the accountable governance of any kind of energy transition, or really, in effect, any sectoral transition, by bringing this kind of analytical understanding to it. So we have Timothy Moss, who's looked at historical transitions over the last century in the energy infrastructure of Berlin. We have Christian Lund, who's looked at land in Indonesia and land use and how that's changing. And land is often not attended to enough in conversations around energy, because certainly we're not going to see energy transitions without concomitant changes in the way land is used. And certainly that takes us into, as Bray pointed out, regions that are often rural, that are often remote, not talked about enough in a lot of the energy transition literature that tends to have an urban focus, which is certainly where a lot of decisions around the energy sector are made, because that's where decision makers are based and where the corridors of power are. And Håvard Harstad takes us into examples of large Norwegian cities, large to the extent that Norway has them, and the zero growth objective in urban transport as another form. Norway's leading on electric mobility, so that's quite an interesting topic as well. And then we have Benjamin Sovacool, who I'm working with now at the moment as a visiting fellow at the University of Sussex, who talks about the Nordic electric vehicle to the transition in the 5 Nordic countries. And finally, we have Stephen Wolf, who I mentioned earlier, who's looked at the need for land for oil and gas projects in Colorado and how you can have market mechanisms to accommodate and compensate the habitat loss to protected species like sage grouse, how you can accommodate biodiversity habitats by having an exchange market, even with the kind of fossil fuel sources that still come up. There's a fair bit of work that's come out in terms of papers, some reports, both global, and then I want to emphasize that these are multi-scalar issues, and I do work right from eco-community scale up to cities and the national. Happy to discuss that more at length, and Bray, if you'll join me, we'll take questions.
Should we take 2 seats?
Here? Will you moderate?
Sorry? Yes. Okay. First question.
Hello, thank you. Tony Edwards, architect. I am part of Transition Kentish Town that has a community energy scheme, Power Up North London. Kentish Town is about 25,000 people, little town 2 kilometres north. I'm interested in the division between the government that has big money to invest in solar, which we need big money invested quickly, commercial investment, which you wonder whether it's going in the right direction or the right amount at the right time, and grassroots community investment. I only want community investment. So far we've got 3 projects built, each about 30 kilowatts, one on a church roof, one on a GP, large new GP practice roof, one on another community building, and they have further projects in view. And I think what is important, while these are very small, I would like your views about how we can move big time with big capital into larger renewable. These schemes have got the interest of the politicians. Certainly local councillors have seen what the ordinary grassroots are doing, and they come along and they join in and thought that's very good, and town and council that rules the area have now declared a climate emergency only a fortnight ago, and the MP, local MP, has also shown great interest. Now I think this, finish off very quickly, getting the grassroots saying, we will only vote for you if you do what we want, and we want more renewable energy, is a way to get to the politicians not going to do anything if they don't think they're going to vote.
So how can you scale up the energy transition?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting, and good to hear that there's some very active developments happening not too far from here. I think there's a couple of things. My current role, I'm moving away a little bit from the community focus and looking partly at what the financial sector are doing in terms of climate action. Long story short, not very much yet, but I do notice a growing interest amongst private sector finance in low carbon investment. And I think this partly stems from that they're realizing, they're not doing that necessarily from the deep of their hearts, but they're realizing that as more and more countries are committing to, say, the Paris Agreement, net zero targets, where does that leave finance, and what's the risk of stranded assets if the financial sector keep investing in high carbon, whether it's companies, projects, etc. So I think from the financial perspective, there is a shift taking place towards paying more and more attention towards how can we align our investments with the Paris Agreement. And I think it will partly be from there where potentially large-scale investment will come from. The other side of the coin is, though, that private investment often follows public investment. And I think that's where the UK, at least, is partly going in the wrong direction by removing the feed-in tariff, for example. So what you need there is, as you say, public pressure to put on politicians to say, look, we need more support for renewables. We still need perhaps those financial those public forms of finances into renewables in order to get that large-scale private finance to come along as well.
I suppose the only thing I'd add is that this idea of what can gain political traction is really a useful way to think. It might not be what we always want, but it certainly seems that part of what we've seen driving energy transitions to the extent that they exist so far is a tendency to prioritize large-scale projects. It's not unique to the energy sector. It's certainly how things have been with infrastructure projects in general. The more that we can, the advantage, let's say, that community-scale projects have is that they do make a lot more sense to the very potential that renewable energy, especially things like solar and small-scale hydro, for instance, that's also coming up in the UK, that they hold if we can get the grid regulations to actually work in a way that recognizes that potential. And so I'd say part of the thrust has to be on really detailed work, putting in place rules, putting in place market mechanisms that allow the true potential to be reflected also in terms of the financial outcomes associated with those projects. I think the good news is that it exists technically, and the bad news is that it doesn't exist because it's coming into a sector that's been shaped with different energy sources in mind, and those interests are still very much around and they're not necessarily going away.
Just very short questions, please.
Sure. So you've talked broadly about governance in the state, so I'm wondering what role do you see the state having in the energy transition?
Shall we take a couple more?
Hi, I'm an energy justice researcher. My question is, with what I know from the community energy place I'm looking at, nobody really is asking where these solar panels are coming from. And I know that we're in danger of replacing a fossil fuel extraction culture with heavy metals extraction. So how far is this the elephant in the room? And I know there's like current research about wind turbines being, the actual fins being quite high kind of greenhouse gases as well. I don't know whether
in Portugal, where there is this mismatch between source of renewables and demand, and assuming limited government resources, does it make more sense to invest in the transmission or in incentivizing small community-based production for local use?
Yes, thank you. I'll leave the Portugal question for you. I'm not even going to attempt to say anything to that. I'm going to start with the second question, if that's okay, in terms of energy justice and thinking about sort of just transitions in relation to if you take the whole supply chain possibly as your view. And I do think you're probably right in saying that's the elephant in the room, or at least one of the elephants in the room, in terms of, especially when thinking from that justice perspective, we've mostly been paying attention to projects as they're being operationalized, but not so much where the resources are coming from or where they're going to. I mean, there's a whole other story, of course, about the afterlife of whether it's solar panels or wind turbines. And I'm not sure if I have much sort of an enlightening answer there, apart from saying it is one of the elephants in the room. And I'd be very interested to know if there is anyone that you know of who has looked at more of a supply chain or a value chain view in relation to energy justice, as well as perhaps what a circular economy would look like in relation to renewable energy and its materials. That's unfortunately all I have to say to that. I'm going to think for a second about the question about governance and the role of the state, because I think you could write about 5 books about that, so I'm just going to think about how to answer it sort of shortly, but I'll go to you first.
All right, so I'll maybe add a comment to that response that you had on energy justice and at least solar. I think one clear low-hanging fruit is procurement practices and codifying them in ways that incentivize more responsible supply line behavior. It's something we've touched on in a recent piece of a colleague that was up on the last slide on the European green capitals, where Lisbon, which is the capital next year, is actually putting in several megawatts of solar capacity within the city, and we try to say, well, to what extent is this obfuscation and taking the effects away outside of the local limits of the city, and to what extent is it really substantively trying to build a more accountable governance model for energy transitions, since they're actually installing it in the city. And that's another issue with energy justice, that a lot of the power consumption happens in urban centers or industrial centers, and a lot of the land footprint of it can be elsewhere, where people don't necessarily benefit. So you could also have ways of spreading those benefits out, which brings me to the Portuguese case. One of the things that happens with solar uptake in municipalities in Portugal is that 1.5% of the profits can be used by the municipality. So it takes away part of the NIMBYism, not in my backyard problem, where municipalities start to recognize that even if it's a small part of the total project cost investments turnover, it's quite a large chunk for a small municipality with a few thousand people. So the scale of production, yes, to some extent we could see this being smaller towns. I think certainly from a carbon perspective, that would mean that we would avoid having large amounts of energy infrastructure being built, which is of course also quite carbon intensive, and I suppose you'd have thoughts on that. So there are intelligent ways of designing energy systems, and I'm not sure that we do very much of it. And again, that brings me back to the political economy issue. And I try to, in talking to different actors, keep in mind that it's not only what makes sense from a system perspective of running an optimal energy system, it's also what is politically feasible. And I find that in fact many people in government, in what is the Secretary of State for Energy's office, which is the political arm of the energy sector in Portugal, they're very aware, they're both technically informed and also politically very savvy in terms of what is possible in, let's say, a country like Portugal with a fairly risk-averse culture. So they don't want to lead, unlike, say, Germany with its energy vendor. They would rather wait a while, not show the most cutting-edge level of ambition, but take the right steps after. And certainly with a neighbor like Spain, which is far bigger in size and better connected to the rest of the continent, we've seen them do things and get burnt. They had policies, they made promises to companies that they couldn't keep up, and that's coming back to haunt them. They're having changed policies. What Portugal's done is go step by step and show that it's reliable, which is part of what they would argue makes them a place that's able to attract billions of euro in investment in the sector. Do you want to take that question on?
Shall I go back
the state and government?
Yes, I've noted down a few thoughts on the question of the role of the state. And think, as I said, I think there's a million different ways to answer that question. Coming from the sort of energy democracy perspective, there will be some proponents of energy democracy who say we need state ownership of the grid. That is one view. I'm not saying that's a right or a wrong one. I think it's one of those ones that's technically feasible. Whether it's politically feasible is a whole different question. Perhaps slightly more feasible, and I think what we are seeing is not so much the national nation state, national governments getting involved in this, but municipal or regional governments, for example, playing a more active role in sort of the management or operation of energy systems. In particular, I'm thinking about the Netherlands, where I grew up. There's not so much community energy in the way that we have it in Scotland. There's far more community municipal partnerships, for example. So those enable the kind of projects that are a size bigger than the sort of 30 kilowatt projects that the gentleman at the front was talking about. So I think that's one role the state could possibly play in terms of collaborating with local people to develop renewable energy projects. At a slightly larger scale, but I think this is relevant to whatever kind of energy system you envisage. It's that sort of long-term vision, and what you hear over and over and over again from speaking to people working on sort of energy transitions, whether they're commercial developers or community groups, is that the incentive schemes, the policies around it, that they're constantly changing. And that's one of the difficulties that community groups have as well, those constant changes, and now, of course, very much the disappearance of the feed-in tariff. People don't know what they're supposed to do, because you don't know if in 2 years the whole landscape's going to be different again. And I think there, especially now that both the UK, devolved governments are committing to net zero targets for the future, for example, I think that is a key opportunity to not just have a target, but to think about how are we actually going to achieve that, and to put in place those long-term sort of policies, or at least have a clear long-term direction in terms of where the energy system could or should go to. That won't happen automatically, and I think that does need a lot of sort of public pressure as well in order to make that happen. But I think simply by having that conversation and by setting those targets now, I think we do have a unique opportunity to develop or start developing that long-term direction.
A couple of quick comments. I've also worked on the other half of the time I spent this working on places like India and Norway, which are quite different contexts in terms of electricity distribution and supply-demand interface in the energy sector. And so I'd say the role of the state in governing energy and energy transitions really depends a lot by context. Sometimes the need is to bring still struggling populations into energy access beyond basic forms, often beyond quite polluting forms that have sort of adverse health impacts as well. At other times it's leading on innovation in ways that are responsible to creating some public benefits, so trying to figure out what grid flexibility looks like, what it can do, to what extent you can roll out smart meters in ways that actually respect privacy, while also finding new models for how you can reward people who are prosuming electricity in distributed ways. So there's a whole lot of different ways.
Thanks a lot. We have maybe 5 minutes for more questions.
I'm Portuguese, so I have special interest in Portugal use case here. So I studied electrical engineering and specialised in renewables, also worked in a microgrid project at the station. And I've always tried to push for energy adoption, solar adoption in Portugal with friends and family over there. And I've exactly found what you found, which is either legislative or monetary policies that are barriers to adoption. So I find that very frustrating, and I wanted to ask, so in the UK you got feed-in tariffs, and you had this system that helped people giving kind of motivation to adopt the domestic solar power. But in a place like Portugal where you might not have the cash reserves to do that, how would you recommend to increase adoption? And a different way also, that's the last question, is like there's a massive lithium-ion reserves in Portugal. Do you think that's going to lead to growth in energy storage usage in Portugal?
Well, thank you both for the talk. You could have publicised the assumption that democratic control leads to just outcomes. And I was wondering, did you observe in your research any kind of general trends in how communities were divided, whether it be gendered or have not lines? And then were there any tactics or strategies you saw that were effective in overcoming them? Cheers.
Okay, one last question.
I'm also chair of a...
Why don't I just shout instead of I'm chair of a community energy company in London as well, and one of the things we found is with the demise of the feed-in tariff, there's a sort of cliff edge fall off in take-up for rooftop schemes mostly, and I'm just wondering if there's any what that does is it drives some innovation around kind of combination modeling. So a community group can put together a solar scheme on a roof and combine it with LED lighting in the same, and offer a cost-saving model across two technologies, one that combines energy saving and the other energy generation. But there is often a problem there with the need for 100% consumption on site. So you've got to be able to sell 100% of the generated energy to the user in the building, albeit at a financially worthwhile rate to be able to repay your investors. So those kinds of models can work, but very often there's a need for some sort of contract for a difference model where policy will support that and de-risk the new modeling. And I'm just wondering if you have any experience of that.
I feel like the questions, the last one plays quite interestingly into the first one. So funnily enough, a couple of weeks ago I had a piece out in a magazine in the Algarve, which is also translated into Portuguese, and I had one of my respondents write in saying enthusiastically, I've seen that piece, I like the argument, and I want to say that I was at a recent meeting by the ministry and they've got all of these new regulations coming out for small-scale solar and for community energy, and I hope that the legislation goes the way they're saying, because then I think that it will make sense. So it's an evolving story in Portugal. The bits that I want to emphasize there as needing to get done are that you open up scope for things like energy cooperatives, that you open up scope for block level sort of peer-to-peer trading, or at least being able to have a distributed ledger there. And there's a push for this within the European Commission. Certainly they want to see positive energy blocks and positive energy districts, 100 of these districts within the next few years in Europe. So we're going to see ways of making this possible. There's one solar energy cooperative in Portugal called Copernico, and they've been experimenting with different models. They've put in place more than a megawatt of total distributed solar capacity, so it's not altogether unsuccessful. What they've struggled with is getting rights to be a supplier. These rights, they have a sort of artificial economic entry barrier, which was about 100,000 euro, and then they won an award for their sort of leading innovative activities, at which point they had 100,000 euro, at which point the transmission and the distribution service operators cited a company in Spain that went broke and lobbied the national regulator to double the sum required to become a supplier. So it's a moving target. If you have 100, you suddenly need 200,000 euro. And why I mention that is if you could be a supplier, you could benefit from things like aggregation, from being able to collect flexibility at the secondary substation level, let's say, and then sell this on. And there's a market around that. Portugal's moving into that flexibility market. There's other countries that are already there. I suppose what I wanted to say to you, I think you had very perceptive insights there, it's just that I think this is the start of something. I think actors like you make it possible, and I don't mean it, I think it's been around for several years to get to this point, but I think it could very easily grow in ways that only require, let's say, not artificial barriers, but politically, economically motivated barriers to move. And I think having that conversation out in the open is certainly something that we try to contribute to from research and find ways to bring it out, as I mentioned, as what is it that we're legitimating, what is seen as being necessary and desirable within the functioning of a sector. On the lithium ion, I think it's a larger question. It's not something I can comment on with a lot of expertise, but if you look at other places, especially I'm thinking of China, it's clearly something where we're going to see a lot of action, and whether it happens responsibly or not gets invisibilized a lot in terms of impacts on labor in different places. Can Portugal do that? On current evidence, it doesn't seem like there's movement, but should there be, there's places like Western India that are putting in massive amounts into manufacturing batteries and parts, so maybe it'll change in a few years.
Yes, I'll try to be brief because I know we're wrapping up. First of all, on the question of democratic control and just outcomes and divisions. So I think the communities that I went to do my research are slightly different because pretty much all of them are rural communities. So they tend to be pretty small in size. They're pretty sort of remote, if you want to use that term. And all of them, or most of them, are not energy cooperatives. So they don't necessarily or they don't necessarily raise money through shares, they simply get a bank loan to develop their project. But sort of the members of the community group, so basically anyone who lives within a village or an area can join that community group and be part of the community energy group. But because so many people live in these villages, or because these people tend to live in these small villages, a lot of the disagreements they have really have nothing to do with energy. You know, they might go back 3 generations when someone's uncle wronged someone's aunt, and the proposed wind turbine is just the latest thing to sort of, reinvigorate that dispute of 25 or 55 years ago. But because a lot of these disagreements go so far back, that also makes them really hard to resolve, because, as I said, in many cases they don't necessarily have anything to do with energy. But that is not to say that energy doesn't play a role, and even in the case that I talked about here, the Alpish Development Group, their first proposal was actually for a wind turbine right behind the main village, and that made everyone go, no, we can't have that. Like, we can't have it behind the one hotel in the village, basically. And there was such a strong and united voice there that the group did take that into account and decided to move the turbine to a different part of the village. But I think for a lot of them, it comes to the point where you have to accept that you can't please everyone. And that's difficult, and I think you do have to be aware if there are particular divisions that take a particular form, especially if there are certain marginalised voices that are marginalised over and over again in community disputes. But I think in the cases I looked at, a lot of the disputes were so sort of random and were, inspired by family feuds and whatnot, that it was really difficult for these groups to deal with that. So while I'm all for, and I do believe, you do have to listen and sort of engage with people, I think a lot of people in these energy groups felt at some point you just have to go ahead, because otherwise you won't get anything done. And that's, I think, a difficult point where you have to decide at what point do you stop engaging, and do you feel like you've reached sort of the maximum or achieved the maximum that you can achieve through engagement. In terms of de-risking, I don't have that much to say about it, apart from that, again, that is a trend that we're definitely seeing, especially in some of the communities in Scotland as well. After the end of the feed-in tariff, everyone's like, what can we do now in terms of energy generation? And you see a lot more local innovation happening in terms of local energy systems where generation is connected to usage. I'm not sure sort of what their strategies are in terms of de-risking, but to me what stands out is that pretty much all those projects are partnerships between local communities and either public and or private sector actors. So I don't necessarily have an answer for you, but I'd be happy to sort of have a chat afterwards to see if there's anything else that might be worth looking at or considering.
Sorry. Thanks a lot. It's great that we all have so many questions. There's more room for questions in the networking reception, and now please join me for another round of applause for